Okay.
Dr. Hernandez, you came to the east side in 1970 as principal of Yerba Buena. What kinds of large issues were going on during, let's say, your first 5 years, 70 to 75?
I think the first issue was the staffing, the qualification of the staffing. I was also, one of my goals was that I wanted to get more minority staff to be more representative of the students that were going to attend Yerba Buena High School and were attending Yerba Buena High School. The second was that they be qualified, that the staffing had to be qualified, to meet the needs, especially in their subject areas that they taught. And that was a challenge, especially since I couldn't get transfers of experienced teachers from other schools. My experience had been with Peterson High School, which opened up as a brand new high school in Santa Clara Unified School District, and they had experienced department chairs automatically. You were given an experienced teacher with a minimum of 3 to 4 years, 5 years of experience in the English department, the math department, all departments. When I came to Yerba Buena High School, I didn't have qualified staff, experienced staff that would volunteer to come over. So I ended up with teachers that were, some of them were, this is their first assignment in teaching. And so that becomes a weakness in and of itself. So that was a big challenge. And then you go to the next level of someone that can feel comfortable talking to our parents. We also have a federal program that I thought was critical to Yerba Buena High School because of the low socioeconomic number of students. The federal funds coming in their Title IV, or not Title II, or Title I. They were large amounts of money that could be spent on the needs of students and staffing, and to meet the needs of students. I think that was a weakness from the direction from the district office, but they weren't used to coordinating that much. Schools were kind of left on their own to provide or not provide. As long as things seemed to be moving forward, it was okay. I think there could have been a closer connection with San Jose State College, Teachers College, for some, training and observation. I think that Mr. Renteria has pointed out the fact, that their training could have been more formalized, especially for young non-college graduates coming into the liaison program because of their youth. So there could have been more things done, I think, that could have been done to reinforce and make it easier. I sometimes question now in retirement how much good all that Title I money made, because we were talking about huge amounts of money. And I don't know what the effectiveness of it was, because we ended up with students that are very low in reading and mathematics. But did we really improve their status after 3 or 4 years? It was hard to get, this was before computers, so it was very hard to keep track of, even statistically, of what your students were doing. Now I think the challenge would be easier to handle, because statistically you could come out with, even leaving names out, you would still have statistics of who's progressing through your programs, what are their needs, how can they be fulfilled. So it's part of that period of time.
Mr. Renteria, what were your experiences during the first 5 years? Major issues?
Well, I think generally speaking, I was fairly young and very green. And I think as Dr. Xan indicated, we lacked a lot of experience. Although at the time, like for example, through the liaison program, and they established this training program at San Jose State, which after the first wave of us went through, it just kind of disappeared. And so that kind of helped us a little bit. One of the things that I remember, I was really super involved in a number of things. I was part of the Title I committees and those kind of issues, and some of the people would say, well, why are you doing that? And I believe that we could have done some that we were making some changes, positive changes. But again, it was one of those situations where we were pretty much left to our own doing. There wasn't too much direction from the district per se, or informed
Or the principalship, for that matter.
Well, I think that it was one of those situations where everybody was just struggling. Okay, we have a new thing here, and we're going to make a difference, but how is that going to take place? And so we were all kind of struggling with that. Biggest changes, again, as I mentioned earlier, was the fact that the district itself was just exploding in terms of numbers. And I know from the district perspective, they probably were had their hands full just trying to figure out the building of new schools. And each one of those schools that was built was just kind of like the latest great creation and concepts, an educational concept.
Which
And
were the
so-
new schools?
Well, after Yerba Buena, as I recall, it was Santa Teresa, and then followed by Independence, which at the time was supposed to be a real model in terms of the Villa concepts. Small school within a large school.
It was the largest high school district in Northern California with 4,500 students.
Yeah.
It was the equivalent of two high schools on one campus.
So from that perspective, I mean, Mr. Fiscalini was just on the cutting edge of those kind of issues, and so.
And
What-
one of the concepts was that because of Frank's hard work and his connections to City Hall, you actually had a public library in the Independence campus. So they ended up with two libraries, one provided by the district, one provided by the city on the campus, which was unheard of until San Jose State came along and took the Martin Luther King Library and put it on their campus.
What kinds of connections did you have with your fellow administrators? What were the positives and the challenges of that relationship?
Well, I think they were very cordial. I mean, I think once the campus got rolling and on itself, I got nothing but positive comments from them and the students, because I think they recognized the challenge of a large minority school, because they'd gone through experiences with an Overfeld High School, Mount Pleasant eventually moved into that arena, Andrew Hill High School, high concentrations of minority students. So they recognized the challenge, and I guess, again, the biggest challenge was although maybe it's a compliment in its way, it got to the point where I'd be, several years later, would be trying to recruit. I remember trying to recruit a candidate to come onto the campus. I interviewed him, and then all of a sudden I got a call from another of the principals and saying, "Wait a minute, you can't have him. I have greater need for him than you." And he ended up, said, "Well, fine, I recognize it." And I said, "Fine, I thought you do have a bigger need than I do." And so he went to become he became a counselor at Andrew Hill High School, Manny Morales.
Okay.
And so that became evident now that, at least to me, it said, fine, we've all got to hustle for the best people we can find here. And that was positive. I think moving in the right direction. And then when Rafael became principal, I'm sure he did the same thing. My observation was that's what he's doing. I mean, meeting the needs of the students.
So
And
when
trying
you
to
were,
connect with parents, and trying to connect with parents. I have an example, for example, at Overfeld High School, talking to a parent that I met through the larger parent groups of 2 or 3 high schools together. Title I, her mother was involved in everything. I mean, you'd see her every time you turned around, involved. And the consequence of that, she had 4 kids, 2 girls. They ended up with scholarships to Stanford. One graduated from Stanford Law, the other one from Stanford Medical. And her 3rd son graduated from San Jose State in engineering.
do you remember the family name?
Acevedo?
What other challenges did you have as the principal at that time?
Well, I think that our challenge was trying to get as many students into colleges. And to be sure that they qualified and were going to succeed in college became a challenge. In terms of trying to make a connection with junior colleges or even San Jose State, so that once our students got on the campus, you know, they would have a place to and a measure of success.
Okay. But before we continue with students, what were the challenges as an administrator regarding relations with other administrators?
But the issue was shortly after the riots that took place at Overfeld. And one of the concerns was that there was no counselors, or that there were no
Connect people.
to connect the people to the community.
The students.
And so there were no counselors available. So Frank had this brainstorm that he was going to do the connection through this program that he was calling the Liaison program.
Pardon me, Mr. Renteria, you mentioned riots at Overfeld. But what year was that?
I think it was, if I recall correctly, it was 1968.
What happened?
Well, I don't know exactly what caused the riots, but all I know is that they did take some effect. There was some gang activity going on, and it was related to that. But anyway, bottom line, one of the issues that they were talking about was, or one of the concerns that was being expressed was that there was a lack of connection with the community. And at the time, the connection with the community was the counselors. Counselors need to be there. And so because of the fact that there were no Raza counselors at the time, I think essentially Frank came up with the idea of liaisons.
Who's Frank?
Frank Fiscalini, I'm sorry. Frank Fiscalini came up with the concept. Well, it was under his leadership. They came up with the concept of
He was the
liaison.
superintendent?
He was the superintendent of the East Side, right. And so it was initiated the summer of 68, because the riots had taken place the previous school year, or previous fall or something like that.
And my recollection of the student uprising was the fact that it was part of what was occurring elsewhere, also like in Oakland, in part of the Civil Rights Act, and the disconnect between public schools, public school district like East Side Union High School District, and the students and parents. And so like when I opened Yerba Buena High School in 1970, after in honor to our own brand new campus, and was that I automatically got 2 liaisons based on the size of the school. And I always felt there wasn't enough direction as to their activities, because as a concept, I think the liaisons could have been used much more effectively, because they were all bright people. I mean, the liaison, to become a liaison, you were very bright, had good social skills, but there still remained a disconnect, I think, in terms of, say, the average classroom teacher and the service they could provide, the liaisons could provide to parents and students.
Yeah, I think some of the originals, I think this is where Al came in very strong, and so did Carlos Molina, because they were the more mature of the group. And Al mainly being connected to the political group of in the area, as well as Carlos. And they kind of provided that kind of leadership to us that were more of the younger ones. But with time, I think the function of the liaison turned more into attendance recovery, and which was important as well. But it kind of lost the impetus of the original concept that making a strong connection to the community.
Yes, or focusing on the real needs of the school. And a lot of it, I think, was the fact that we could invite parents to come to the school. But if there had to be somebody to meet them that would have the time to sit down and talk to them and go through all their real concerns. And even the parents that came to the campus were probably only represented maybe at the most 2% of the total population, Mexican-American population, because it's such a foreign idea to really go to the schools. You know, as I was going to school, my parents would always assume that the school would take care of me, all my needs, and so they didn't understand the structure. I think liaison programs are, I don't know what function they're performing now. It'd have to be that would be an interesting question.
I think my sense of what the liaison today is strictly attendance. It appears to me that that's what it is.
That's recovery.
Yeah, attendance recovery, and which is a very important aspect, but it had the potential of being more than that.
Yeah.
One of the things that was kind of the requirement is that you had to be bilingual,
Oh, of
a
course.
strong bilingual, in order to communicate with the Hispanic population, because that was the concern, is that there was a gap between the schools and the Hispanic population. Then there was also definitely a gap between the black population and the schools. Although the numbers at the time of blacks was smaller, significantly smaller.
It's about 8% when I came in of the total student population.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to observe, speaking of parent participation in the ethnic groups in the Eastside Union High School District, is the fact that when the Vietnamese parents arrived, you know, and we started enrolling students in Yerba Buena High School, was one of the probably larger student populations of Vietnamese, was that they came, the first time I met a Vietnamese gentleman, he came to my office and wanted to talk to me. And then I asked him if he had any children there, and he said, no, I don't. And I said, well, then I can't speak to you about individual students, you know, because that's a privacy. He says, well, I have the parents' permission to talk to you. And I said, okay, we can follow that up and see that. But he really spent time on the campus over a period of months. And in fact, I wondered what he did for a living. But it was all very positive, and he was ensuring that the students were being looked after, and although he was just a community person, so which is what the Hispanic population needed.
Yeah.
With someone like
What
that.
was interesting is at the time when the Vietnamese came over, the first wave of the Vietnamese that came over, one of the characteristics of that group was they were more affluent. And consequently, they all spoke French.
Oh, see, I didn't know that.
And since I was a counselor at the time and I could speak French, I had to deal with a lot of the Vietnamese
Parents.
parents and incoming students.
Yeah.
How did you learn to speak French?
Oh, that was, originally that was my a major in college.
Yeah. Oh,
Dr. Hernandez, were you in the Eastside District in 1968? Do you know anything about these riots he's
I came
talking
to the
about?
district in 1970. For almost, I was the first Hispanic principal in the district. There were 10 high schools, and everybody else was white. And in fact, there were no women principals at that
You know,
time.
it was funny, I was trying to
were
remember
a few-
who the principals were, and I said, you know what, there were no women.
There weren't any. There were a couple of vice principals, but no females. And I became the first Hispanic principal. But going back to the Vietnamese community, I almost felt after that, the reference to the Vietnamese gentleman that came to visit me, was that the school was being inspected.
It was being inspected.
The group, he was
Yeah.
actually deciding where the students would go. And if the environment there, if we had shown them, you know, because I took them on a tour of the campus and introduced them to a few teachers that happened to be walking by. And then after about 2 or 3 weeks, the students start showing up. And then all of a sudden, we ended up with one of probably, if not the first, second largest group of Vietnamese students. In other words, had passed some kind of inspection as to where the parents were mobile enough so they could decide which high schools they could go to and not. And they would move into that area where they wanted to go.
You know what, I never thought about it, but I know that I used to counsel with a lot of the Vietnamese and speak with them in French, but I never thought that whether that might have been a factor or not.
Yeah. And that's reinforced now today, like we have the city of Cupertino, which is high ratios of Asians living in that community, which is a very affluent community with good schools. And that's where the children go, to good schools.
Yeah.
That becomes a very critical factor, apparently. So, as an educator, we still have a lot to learn.
Yes, we do.
Regarding the liaisons, when you became a liaison, when they started the liaison program, were there any models, or what kind of training did you have to start off the program?
There weren't any models, however, I know that we started attending some classes through San Jose State, and God, I forget the name of the professor. He was in the counseling department that set up some workshops for liaisons and worked on issues of communication skills and a number of other issues. And I think that I know that through that program I earned my first, they call it a counselor's associate degree from San Jose State. It wasn't a full counseling certificate, but it was an associate. And that's actually what kind of put me in a counseling position, because when I started work as a certificated person, I was a part-time Spanish teacher and part-time counselor. And then when YB opened and we were in double session at Yerba Buena, I worked as part-time counselor and part-time Spanish teacher. And as a matter of fact, it was John Celerol and I that built the first master schedule. At that point, I had been dealing with the master schedules through the experience at Silver Creek. And I think John came as, he was a department head from IE and had been appointed the APED. So we worked together.
What is IE?
Industrial education.
From which school?
He came from
Silver
Orfeld.
Creek. John Salro?
No, he came from Orfeld.
Well, he might have been, but by the time he slipped over, he was an IE coordinator.
Yes, he was, right.
A coordinator. And then he was appointed
Okay.
assistant principal in charge of the educational development,
Okay.
APED.
Dr. Hernandez, where did would you tell us about your professional experience? You came to the East Side in 70.
70.
Where were you the previous few years?
Well, let's see. I graduated from college in 1954.
Which
and then,
college?
Became a Korean veteran for 2 years
Which college?
at San Jose State. I attended San Jose State. And then in 56, I went back. I was a marketing major. That was my major, marketing major and Spanish minor. But I couldn't even get an interview. I literally nobody wanted to interview me.
Why do you think
And
that
so
was?
the Army was hiring in Korea, so I went in for 2 years. When I came back, I decided I was going to teaching, so I became a student again in 56 for 2 years, and ended up with a Spanish major and a business minor. And then I taught the first year in Mountain View High School in 1956, and then went to Bookster High School as a classroom teacher for 5 years, and then became a vice principal of Peterson High School when it opened up, the third high school in the Santa Clara Unified School District. And then I was there 5 years, and in 1970, then went to the East Side as the principal of a brand new high school. That they were building a beautiful campus, and that, I'm sure, had a lot to do with the success of the whole experiment, because it was a beautiful, laid out, student-oriented campus.
Mhm.
I wanted to ask you, your comment about being a marketing major and no one was hiring. What was that about?
Well, basically, when you graduate from college and you go to job interviews right on campus, placement, and you sign up, or you ask to be placed in an interview, along about April, graduating in June, nobody would interview me. And finally, one person did, because the secretaries just got so tired of seeing me, I guess, or please give him an interview. And I sat down and I said, will this lead to anything? And he said, no, I don't think I think you're in the wrong major. So it was a sign of the economic times and the struggles that a lot of people gone through, not just me. It wasn't, I don't think it was personal, as they would say. It was just the fact that they wouldn't hire a Latino in that period of time. You know,